This video is designed to go over some of the key concepts that deal with measuring with fractions of an inch, and this is from lesson 9-2. The goal for today, we're going to be able to measure and draw lengths to the nearest inch, quarter inch, and eighth of an inch. So what we have here, we have a ruler just like the one you'll be using in the lesson today, and you can see that the ruler is broken down into 1/16 of an inch. And so what that means is that from the 3 to a 4, or between every inch there are 16 different sections. Okay, so each little line from there to there is a 1/16 of an inch. The other line is a 1/16 of an inch. Now it's important to understand what each parts of this ruler represent, or each of these dashes, what they actually represent. So we're going to take a look at from the 5 to the 6. Okay, so we could see some things that we need to understand with this ruler. The very long line that's right in the center actually represents a 1/2 of an inch. In this case, it would be 5.5 inches would be that measurement. Now another part of this ruler, we can see that this line right down there, from the 5 to that line, you can see it's not quite as long as that 1/2 inch line. This represents actually a quarter of an inch. Okay, so we can see that's 1/4. This could even be 1/2 the middle line, or even 2/4. And then the final line there, we could say that represents 3/4 or 3/4 of an inch. And the final one there could be 4/4. Okay, so you can see 1, 2, 3, 4 sections within from 5 to 6 inches, okay, represents a quarter of an inch for each section. Now we're going to take a look at an eighth of an inch here. And it's important to understand that an eighth of an inch is actually smaller than a quarter of an inch, and so on. So we're going to start out with our 5 there. And then every other line after our 5 is going to represent an eighth of an inch. So we have here, oops, made a little mistake there. We have this line right here is 1/8. Okay, skipping a line, going to another line here, we have 2/8 of an inch, which is actually, you can simplify that to 1/4 of an inch, and so on. Okay, this represents 3/8, 4/8 or a 1/2, 5/8, 6/8 or 3/4, 7/8, and then 8/8 or 1 inch. So that's important to know whenever you're dealing with a ruler. Now, a key tip for today, when measuring to the nearest eighth of an inch, always reduce your fractions to simplest terms. So that's a key tip that we're going to think about for today. It's important to reduce your fraction to simplest terms. Now, key tips for measurement. It's always important to understand this. When measuring to the nearest inch, your measurement will always be a whole inch. So it'll always fall on 1 inch or 3 inches or 8 inches, whenever be a fraction associated with it. Measuring to the nearest 1/2 inch, your measurement will be either a whole inch or a 1/2 of an inch. For example, we'll either have 8 inches if it falls on that, or we can have measurements like 7.5 inches. Measuring to the nearest quarter of an inch, your measurements can be a quarter, a 1/2, 3/4, or 1 inch. Okay, so 8 1/4, 8 3/4, and so on. Measuring to the nearest eighth of an inch, your measurements can be 1/8, 1/4, 3/8, 1/2, 5/8, 3/4, 7/8, or 1 Okay, so we can see an eighth of an inch gets it pretty specific and pretty narrowed down. Now let's say, for example, we have a measurement and we're measuring it to the nearest whole inch, and it falls right here on 2.5 inches. Whenever you're measuring it to the nearest whole inch, think about rounding. If it's 2.5 inches to the nearest whole inch, whenever it falls right on the 1/2, that would actually be a measurement of 3, oops, let me fix this here, 3 inches. Now, if I had a measurement and it falls right on the 2, obviously to the nearest whole inch, that would be 2 inches. If it fell on the 4 to the nearest whole inch, that would be 4 inches. So now let's think about measuring it to the nearest 1/2 of an inch. If it falls anywhere on the quarter marks here within my inch, you always round up to the next 1/2 of an inch. If it falls on 3 inches there, even to the nearest 1/2 of an inch, it would be a measurement of 3 inches. If it fell on the 4, even to the nearest half of an inch, it would be 4 inches. Okay, and then obviously right on the 3.5 inches, it would be 3.5 inches there. Now looking at a measurement to the nearest quarter of an inch, okay, it's important to understand any measurement that falls right in the middle, okay, if it's, for example, let's say we have 3 1/8 of an inch, okay, that can be rounded up to 3 1/4 of an inch. Okay, so whenever something falls right in the middle between the quarter inches, you always round up. Okay, if it were a measurement of 3 3/8 of an inch, okay, you would continue to round up. If it would be a measurement of, right on 4 inches, still round, or measuring it to the nearest eighth of an inch, you would still have a measurement of 4 inches. Now we're going to talk about measurements to the nearest eighth of an inch. It is important to remember the measurements whenever you're measuring to the nearest eighth of an inch. It can be 1/8, 1/4, and so on, all the way up to 1 whole inch. So it's important to always reduce. So it's pretty easy whenever you're measuring to the nearest eighth of an inch because it's pretty specific here. Just remember every other line on from 4 inches to 5 inches or whatever you're looking at represents an eighth of an inch on your ruler. Okay, so I have 4 inches there. I skip a line. This line right here represents 4 1/8 of an inch. Okay, now if I fall right in between there, okay, I could still round up. I would round up to 4 1/8 of an inch. Okay, if I were to measure something and it landed right on the 1/2 inch mark, okay, this represents actually 4 4/8 of an inch. However, we reduce that fraction to 4 1/2 of an inch there. Okay, once again, if I'm taking a look at another measurement, and let's say, for example, we're looking at this, and there's a measurement that falls right at the 5, and that's really actually 5 5/16 mark. I can round it right up to the 6, so that would represent 6 inches. Erase some things here. Now let's say, for example, I had a measurement and it landed right here. Okay, that actually represents 5 7/8 of an inch. Okay, and we can just keep it right there at 5 7/8 of an inch. So those are some of the key concepts when dealing with measurement. Remember, it is extremely important to always remember these key tips for measurement. So if you're measuring to the nearest inch, your measurement will always be 1 whole inch. If you're measuring to the nearest half of an inch, your measurement will always be either a whole inch or a half of an inch. Okay, measuring to the nearest quarter of an inch, you can see the appropriate measurements that you will have, and then finally measuring to the nearest eighth of an inch, you can see what all the measurements will represent here. And so those are some of the key tips whenever you're measuring using the customary units of measurement.